So today we are going to talk a little bit about what climate change is and what's causing it, but then we're going to spend most of the time talking about what we can do about it. We're going to focus on 3 examples of innovations and designs that are working to help us live more sustainably and adapt to climate change and reduce our impact on the environment. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what climate change is. Now, raise your hand if you've ever seen these stripes before. Are these familiar to anybody? Okay, so these are some pretty cool stripes, and you might start to see them more often. These are called the warming stripes. So each individual stripe represents an average global temperature since 1850. So stripes that are darker blue are years that were colder, and stripes that are darker red are years that were warmer. And you might notice as we move from the 1850s to the present, there's a lot more red. And the reason is because our planet has been warming. And these warming stripes suggest that global temperatures have increased by about 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1850. Now, the main reason that temperatures are increasing is related to something called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is the process through which heat is trapped near Earth's surface because of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So, energy from the sun makes its way to the surface of the Earth, and that energy gets absorbed by the surface. Now, some of that energy gets re-emitted back into space, but another part of that energy gets trapped by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, it turns out the greenhouse effect is actually really important for life on Earth. If we didn't have an atmosphere and we didn't have greenhouse gases, then the temperature on Earth wouldn't be suitable for living things. But the problem arises when we have too many greenhouse gases and too much of that heat and energy is getting trapped. And that's exactly what's been happening. There are greenhouse gases like CO2, water vapor, methane that are being emitted, excess, and trapping more of that heat. And a lot of the sources of these excess greenhouse gases are coming from burning fossil fuels. So this is resulting in more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And what this means is that less of that energy is being re-emitted back into space, and more of it is being trapped near the Earth's surface, contributing to warmer temperatures and causing these patterns that we've seen over the past 2 centuries. Now, this increase in warming has a handful of other global impacts. These can include things like increased wildfires, more severe storms, flooding, droughts. So there's a lot of serious issues that our planet is facing related to climate change. But the good news is that there are a lot of people and a lot of scientists working really hard to try to figure out what we can do about this, how we can mitigate climate change, how we can live in a way that's more sustainable. So today, we're going to focus on 3 specific examples of innovative designs that are working towards more sustainable lifestyles. First, we're going to explore how bubbles can dampen noise from wind farms. Then we're going to talk about how seaweed might be able to reduce methane from cows. And finally, we'll explore how sustainable farming in the form of hydroponic farming might allow us to grow food in a more sustainable way. So for our first example, let's talk about bubbles and wind farms. So, wind energy is an example of renewable energy. It's a way of producing energy that is less harmful to the environment than burning fossil fuels. Other types of renewable energy include things like solar power, hydroelectric power, and you may have seen large wind farms like this on land before. But what's starting to become more common are offshore wind farms and huge wind farms that are being built in the oceans. Now, this is a really incredible resource for renewable energy because wind over the ocean is a lot stronger and more consistent. So we can get a lot of power from these wind farms. But there are some drawbacks. The construction of these wind farms actually causes a lot of noise. Specifically, the stage of the construction process where that wind turbine is being driven down into the bottom of the ocean floor. It creates about 200 decibels of noise. So to put that into context, a jet engine taking off is about 140 decibels. City traffic that you may have heard on your way into the museum this morning is about 85 decibels, and a conversation that you have in a normal voice is about 60 decibels. So these are some really loud sounds that are being produced from the construction of these wind farms. marine mammals like whales who rely on being able to hear in the ocean and use sounds in order to communicate and find food. So we have a bit of a problem here. We have this really awesome way of producing renewable energy from wind, but we don't want to build these offshore wind farms at the cost of harming marine life. So what do we do? Well, one solution is something called a bubble crane. So bubble cranes are an invention that were produced in a research lab in Germany, and they actually reduce noise that comes from the construction of these wind turbines. So the way that it works, a large tube is placed on the ocean floor surrounding the site where the wind turbine is going to be drilled down. And in that tube, there are tiny little holes. People then push air through these tubes, and the air comes out of the holes in the form of bubbles, and essentially produces a wall of air bubbles surrounding the construction site, like we can see in these photos. And these air bubbles are actually able to dampen and reduce the noise and how far it travels. So how exactly does this work? Well, it all relates to the way in which sound travels in air versus water. So in air, sound travels about 340 meters per second. That's about the length of 3.5 football fields. Now, does anybody have any guesses? How many football fields do you think sound can travel in water in 1 second? Any guesses? 5, okay. Anyone else? Yeah. 10, okay. These are awesome guesses. So, 15 football fields. So sound in water travels about 4.5 times faster than in air. So what that means is that as sound is traveling away from these wind turbines, they're moving through the water at a fast speed, and then they encounter those air bubbles, and they significantly slow down. And that dampens the noise. So when we have a wind farm that's being constructed, and that noise is moving away, if we put a bubble curtain right there, it can actually reduce the noise by up to 85%. And research suggests that adding a second bubble curtain can reduce the noise by up to 99%. So this is a really cool way that we can think about sustainably building these wind farms and producing renewable energy while protecting marine life. And some new offshore wind farms are starting to implement this technology. So Vineyard Wind, which is a wind farm that is a newly constructed wind farm off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, so not too far from here, just used bubble curtains in the construction of the most recent wind turbines last year. So we might start to see these bubble curtains appearing in new construction of wind farms in the future as well. So now let's take a little bit of the ocean and bring it onto land and talk about how red seaweed might be able to reduce methane from cows. Now, what is methane? Well, this chart is showing the percentage of greenhouse gases that are emitted by humans. So carbon dioxide makes up about 76% of human greenhouse gas emissions, and CH4 is methane, which accounts for about 16%. So there's not as much methane being emitted, but methane is 30 times more efficient at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. So a little methane can go a long way in harming the planet. Now, there are a handful of different human-related sources of methane. These can include things like landfill, manure management, and the two biggest sources of methane. The first is from natural gas and petroleum, and the second biggest source of human-produced methane, that accounts for 1/4 of all methane, comes from cowbirds. Now, the scientific term for cowbirds is enteric fermentation. That's a big word, so let's talk about what it means. Enteric fermentation is a digestive process that happens in the cow's stomach and actually produces methane as a byproduct of digestion. So the way that this works is a cow goes along and eats its food, and the food makes its way to the stomach. Once it's in the stomach, there's bacteria that break down that food and ferment it. And in this fermentation process, a couple of gases are produced, specifically carbon dioxide and hydrogen gas. There are then another set of tiny organisms called methanogens that take that carbon dioxide and hydrogen gas and turn it into methane. So as a cow continues to eat food and this digestive process continues, continues to happen, more and more methane builds up, and that methane eventually has to go somewhere. So when a cow burps, that methane goes into the atmosphere. And there are a lot of cows on Earth, so a lot of methane is produced from this process. So what can we do about this? Well, there's a handful of research happening looking at ways to reduce this issue and this source of methane, but one promising solution is related to a type of red seaweed known as Asparagopsis taxiformis. So this is a species of red seaweed that lives in tropical ocean environments, and research suggests that it contains a compound that can actually inhibit or prevent the production of methane. So a group of scientists studied this. They took a bunch of this red seaweed and dried it up and ground it into a really, really fine powder. They then added a little bit of this seaweed powder to the cow's food to test how it impacted the amount of methane being produced. So they did this for 3 different scenarios. The first scenario was adding no seaweed to the food. This was to get a baseline to understand how much methane is being produced on a cow's regular diet. Then the second scenario, they added a small amount of red seaweed equal to only 0.25% of the weight of the cow's food. And then they added a little bit more for the third scenario, equal to 0.5% of the total weight of the cow's food. So we're talking about a really small amount of seaweed being added. But what they found was that despite the small amount of seaweed, it had a huge impact on the amount of methane being produced. And one study in particular found that adding this amount of seaweed to the cow's food actually reduced the amount of methane being produced by 80%. So this is a really cool way that we can potentially reduce the amount of methane coming from the second largest source of human-related methane. Now, there are a lot of cows, like I mentioned, so we would need a lot of this red seaweed in order for this method to actually have a global impact. So researchers and organizations are trying to find ways to sustainably get this seaweed so that we can build up our supply in order to apply it to all these cows. There are organizations like Blue Ocean Barns that are trying to figure out how we can grow this seaweed in a lab. And other organizations like Greener Grazing are trying to figure out if we can grow this seaweed in other climates outside of the tropical oceans. Now, this is a little bit about how changing a cow's diet might be able to create a more sustainable lifestyle. Let's talk a little bit how our diets affect the environment and how our food can be more sustainable. So, raise your hand if you've ever eaten a peach before. Okay, how about a carrot? Okay, how about some lettuce? Okay, we've all probably eaten some of these foods, some of the foods up here. We all need food to survive. It gives us the energy that we need to live. But a lot of the food that we eat takes a long journey before it makes its way onto our plates and into our stomachs. And in a lot of cases, the first step of that journey is a piece of land that somehow needs to be changed in order to make it suitable for growing that food. Once that land is ready for the food to be grown, we actually grow the food, we farm it. Whether it's a vegetable or fruit that's being grown, or a crop that's being grown to then feed an animal that we then use as food, or a crop that's grown and then turned into a totally different type of food. It usually starts with some sort of food being grown. Once that food is grown, it enters the supply chain, where it gets processed and packaged and transported and ultimately sold to people. Now, each step of this food production process produces greenhouse gas emissions. And the entire food production process, as it is right now, accounts for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a huge amount of greenhouse gases coming just from the way that we're producing our food. Now, each step of this process has a different impact. It releases a different amount of greenhouse gases. So let's take a quick vote to see which of these 3 steps we think produces the most greenhouse gases. Raise your hand if you think land use change produces the most. Okay, people raise your hand if you think farming produces the most greenhouse gases. Okay, raise your hand if you think the supply chain. Okay, so I also thought the supply chain when I first was looking into this. It turns out It's actually farming that accounts for most of the greenhouse gases related to food production. And of that 58%, about half of that is from something that we just talked a lot about, cow births. That methane coming from cows contributes a lot to this food production greenhouse gas emissions. So regardless of the amount of greenhouse gases being produced in each step of the process, the takeaway is that we might want to rethink how we're producing this food, since it is contributing a ton of greenhouse gases. So one way to do this is to think about switching away from traditional farming that has these big environmental impacts and switching towards more sustainable methods of farming. Now, one example of a sustainable farming method is something called hydroponic farming. So hydroponic farming is a way of growing food without any soil. Instead, the roots of plants are submerged in a nutrient-rich water. Now, all of these photos up here are examples of hydroponic farms. And you can see that they look pretty different. They can be walls and walls of plants being grown in a large warehouse, or a small container on your countertop. And that's one of the cool things about hydroponic farms. They're really flexible and versatile. They can take many different shapes and sizes, which means you can grow food in lots of different places. Now, regardless of what the hydroponic farm looks like, the one thing they all have in common is this nutrient-rich water. So all hydroponic farms start out with a pool of nutrient-rich water. That water then gets transported up to the roots of the plants. And the plants take up those nutrients, take up that water, and use it to grow. But the key thing here is that whatever water doesn't get used gets recycled and put back into that initial pool of water, so that it can get reused by the next round of plants in the next watering cycle. So all of this combined, it leaves us with a really cool and sustainable way of growing food. Hydroponics provides a way to grow fresh, healthy food with small spaces, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and less water. Now, raise your hand if you've ever seen a hydroponic farm before. Anyone? Okay, a few of us. So if you didn't raise your hand, turn around and look right under the escalators. That big box that's glowing purple on the left, that is actually a hydroponic farm. So that hydroponic farm is a Freight Farm. So Freight Farms is a Boston-based company that creates hydroponic farms inside of old shipping containers. So right now, we're growing a handful of different crops and vegetables. As of this morning, some of the things we were growing include lettuce, basil, arugula, Swiss chard, and dandelion greens. And all of this food is being used for two purposes here at the museum. The first is to feed some of the animals in our live animal care center, including tortoises and lizards and chinchillas and rabbits. But as of just a few weeks ago, the greens that are being grown in our hydroponic farm are also featured in the cafe. So if you come back another day and have lunch or grab a snack this afternoon, keep an eye out for signs that say Freight Farms or list Freight Farm greens in the ingredients, because a lot of the salads offered in the cafe are directly from that farm. So in addition to some of these environmental benefits of hydroponic farms, we talked about less land use, fewer emissions, and less water use. There are also some societal benefits. So one of the really cool things about hydroponic farms, we've already talked about a bit, is that they can be grown anywhere, really. They can be grown in a museum, or on a countertop, or in a huge warehouse. So what this means is that we can grow lots of food in places where traditional farming is impossible, including urban spaces. Hydroponic farms also have a really fast growth rate because we're able to perfectly control the conditions inside the farm in order to optimize the growth. In fact, last week in our hydroponic farm, we grew 50 pounds of greens. So this is a huge amount of food that's being produced. So the combination of being able to grow a lot of food really fast in densely populated areas might be a way to start to think about making food more accessible. So, we covered a lot today. We talked a little bit about how bubble curtains can reduce noise from offshore wind farm construction. We explored how adding red seaweed to a cow's diet might be able to decrease the methane we produce. And we talked about how hydroponic farming is an example of sustainable farming. Now, these are all kind of big picture solutions or ideas, but there's a lot that you can do in your everyday lives to live more sustainably as well. Some examples can include biking or taking public transport, thinking about where your food is coming from and if there are more sustainable ways of getting that food. Exploring options for community gardens in your neighborhood, or maybe there's even a hydroponic farm nearby that you can volunteer at or get food from. Also, just using your voice to talk about climate change and have these types of conversations can go a really long way. So I want to leave you with this QR code, which has some more information about the 3 stories that we talked about today. It also has some resources for how you can live more sustainably, how you can talk about climate change, and how you can cope with climate change anxiety.